Ancient Rome, a civilization that conquered the world through order, discipline, and sheer power. But beneath the marble temples, the golden statues, and the proud cries of Ave Caesar, there was something darker, a hunger, a craving that no empire could satisfy. It was not for wealth, nor glory, nor conquest, but for blood. For 4 centuries, the Roman arenas became temples of death, where men, women, and even animals were offered as sacrifices to the insatiable crowd. This is the story of Rome's blood games, the most sadistic spectacles in human history. It began as ritual. Before the empire, before the Colosseum, there were funerals, munera, offerings of blood to honor the dead. In the early days of Rome, families would host small fights between slaves beside the graves of nobles. The belief was simple: the blood of the living would appease the spirits of the dead. But soon, these private rituals became public entertainment. The Roman Republic discovered something powerful: that death could be addictive. Crowds gathered, senators sponsored games to win favor. By 200 BC, the funeral rites had evolved into grand spectacles where dozens, even hundreds, were forced to fight for survival. Rome was no longer mourning the dead. It was celebrating death itself. And as the empire grew, so did its appetite. The games became more elaborate, more theatrical, more horrifying. It wasn't enough to kill. It had to be art. Step into the Colosseum. 50,000 people screaming in unison. The emperor seated high above, surrounded by gold and ivory. Below, sand stained red. The Romans called it arena, from the Latin for sand, the material that absorbed the blood. The games were divided into acts. The morning began with animal hunts, venaciones. Exotic beasts from across the empire, lions, elephants, bears, even giraffes, were shipped to Rome, locked in darkness for days, and released into the arena to face professional hunters. The people loved it. The sight of lions tearing men apart was a morning appetizer. By noon, the executions began. Criminals and prisoners were brought in. Some were burned alive. Others were crucified. Many were forced to reenact myths. A man playing Icarus was thrown from a tower. Another as Orpheus, torn apart by beasts. It was theater, rewritten in blood. And when the sun reached its highest point, the main event began. The gladiators entered. To the Romans, gladiators were both heroes and slaves. They were owned, trained, and branded. Some were criminals. Others were conquered soldiers or debtors. The average lifespan of a gladiator? Less than 3 years. They lived in barracks under constant supervision, eating a diet of barley and beans to build mass. And when their names were called, they were marched into the arena to die for the crowd's amusement. But here lies the paradox. Rome adored them. Men who were stripped of freedom became symbols of courage and power. Gladiators became celebrities. Women carved their names on walls. Some even offered themselves to them. Jewelry was made from their sweat, bottled and sold as aphrodisiacs. A gladiator's life was pain, but also fame. And perhaps, in a world where every man feared Caesar, the only true gods were those who could look death in the eye and smile. No man embodied the corruption of Rome's games more than its emperors. Julius Caesar expanded them to win the people's hearts. Augustus turned them into propaganda. But it was Caligula and Nero who made them madness incarnate. Caligula once ordered an entire audience executed, simply because he was bored. Nero filled the arena with actors forced to die on stage, claiming it was performance art. But the worst came under Emperor Commodus, the same man immortalized in legend and film as the mad son of Marcus Aurelius. Commodus declared himself a living god. He entered the arena dressed as Hercules, wielding a golden sword. He killed hundreds of animals, some chained, others already wounded. He even fought gladiators, but with blunted weapons, while theirs were made of wood. And when a wounded man begged for mercy, Commodus smiled and personally slit his throat. Each drop of blood on the sand was a tribute, not to Rome's glory, but to the emperor's ego. Few know that women, too, fought in Rome's arenas. They were called gladiatrices. Records speak of female fighters who battled both beasts and men for the crowd's amusement. They were exoticized, dressed in revealing armor, their bodies displayed as part of the spectacle. One inscription found in Pompeii reads, "The crowd admired the women's courage, but the gods turned away their eyes." Their presence blurred the lines between entertainment and humiliation. These women were paraded not for skill, but for scandal. Symbols of Rome's obsession with turning even dignity into spectacle. Not all victims were gladiators or criminals. During certain festivals, such as the games celebrating Trajan's victory over Dacia, thousands of captives were executed. Ancient historians claim that in one festival alone, over 10,000 men and women were slaughtered across 123 days. The crowd didn't come to see who would win. They came to see who would die. Children of foreign kings were paraded before being killed. Entire tribes were forced into mock battles, unarmed against trained Roman soldiers. The emperor would raise his hand, and 1,000 lives would end before lunch. It was no longer entertainment. It was ritualized genocide, the empire feeding itself on its own cruelty. Why did they cheer? How could tens of thousands of Romans rise to their feet, screaming for blood, laughing at the dying? The answer lies not in savagery, but in psychology. To the Romans, death in the arena was purification. The arena was a mirror, reflecting the empire's power and the god's will. Watching others die reminded them that they themselves were alive, and that the empire was eternal. But deep beneath the applause, there was fear. Every citizen knew that one wrong word, one false accusation, and they could be the next to fall on that blood-soaked sand. So they screamed louder, not out of joy, but to drown their own terror. The fall of the blood games didn't come from mercy. It came from exhaustion. By the 4th century, the empire was bleeding, politically, financially, spiritually. The cost of keeping the games alive was immense. Hundreds of animals, thousands of fighters, massive amphitheaters, all for a dying empire's illusion of power. When Christianity spread, it condemned the games as barbaric. The philosophers called them a plague on the soul. Finally, in the year 404 AD, a monk named Telemachus stepped into the arena, shouting for the killing to stop. The crowd stoned him to death. But his sacrifice ended a tradition that had lasted 600 years. The Colosseum fell silent. The sand turned cold, and Rome's thirst for blood finally died. So what do we see when we look back at Rome's blood games? We see a civilization that could build aqueducts that still stand, yet found beauty in destruction. We see emperors who called themselves gods, yet trembled before the crowd's applause. And we see ourselves, because the hunger for spectacle has never truly vanished. It only changed its shape. Perhaps Rome never fell. Perhaps it just moved to the screens we hold in our hands. Because history may not repeat itself, but it always performs an encore.